Edit. The people who celebrate your downfall too early usually do not realize they are standing at the beginning of their own disappointment. My name is Garrett Walker, and the strangest Christmas of my life began with applause. Snow drifted quietly across the front yard as I pulled into the driveway of my wife's parents' house on Christmas Eve. The neighborhood looked like a postcard. White lights wrapped around trees. Inflatable reindeer stood beside mailboxes. Warm yellow lights spilled from windows all along the street. Inside the Bennett house, Christmas music played softly through hidden speakers, and the smell of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh cookies filled the air. Everything looked perfect. That should have been my first warning. I stepped inside carrying a bottle of wine and a few wrapped gifts. Susan Bennett greeted me with a polite smile. Richard Bennett shook my hand. Kevin Bennett gave me a quick nod from across the room. Nicole stood beside the Christmas tree wearing a dark green sweater, smiling at guests as they arrived. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Children laughed while opening presents. Relatives gathered around the fireplace. Conversations drifted from football to travel plans to family memories. Yet something felt different. Every time I looked around the room, I noticed people exchanging quick glances. Tiny smiles. Brief looks toward Nicole. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore. I had spent years reading people during business negotiations. You learn to recognize when a room knows something you do not. About an hour after dinner, Richard stood and tapped a spoon against his wine glass. Conversations slowly faded. The room became quiet. Everyone turned toward him. I expected a holiday toast. Instead, Richard smiled and looked directly at Nicole. She stood up holding a thin folder in her hands. My stomach tightened instantly. Not because I knew what was coming. Because some part of me already suspected. Nicole walked toward me. Her expression remained calm. Too calm. She placed the folder on the coffee table and slid it toward me. "Garrett," she said softly, "I think it is time." The room was silent. Even the children seemed unusually quiet. I opened the folder. Divorce papers. For several seconds, I simply stared at the pages. 20 years of marriage reduced to legal documents resting beside a glowing Christmas tree. The fireplace crackled in the background. Christmas lights reflected from glass ornaments hanging only a few feet away. The contrast felt surreal. Slowly, I looked up. Nicole folded her arms. Richard raised his wine glass. Then something happened that I will never forget. Richard smiled and said, "To new beginnings." A few relatives laughed. Someone started clapping. Then another person joined. Within moments, several members of the family were applauding. Actual applause. On Christmas Eve, at the end of a marriage, Kevin leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. One cousin whispered something that made another relative laugh. Around the room, faces showed excitement instead of sympathy, celebration instead of concern. For a moment, I simply watched. Not because I was shocked, because I was learning. There is a difference. Shock fades quickly. Understanding stays with you forever. In that moment, I finally understood exactly how these people viewed me. The strange part was that I did not feel angry. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Instead, I felt calm. Calmer than I had felt in months. Maybe because something inside me had already accepted what my eyes were seeing. Nicole reached into the folder and handed me a pen. "You can have your attorney review everything later," she said. "But I would appreciate it if we handled this respectfully tonight." Everyone watched, waiting, expecting resistance, expecting questions, expecting a scene. Instead, I picked up the pen. I signed the first page, then the second, then the last. The room became noticeably quieter. Several people exchanged confused low. The cold air hit my face the moment I stepped outside, and for the first time all evening, I could think clearly. Snow crunched beneath my shoes as I crossed the driveway toward my truck. Behind me, the Bennett house glowed with warm Christmas lights, laughter still drifting faintly through the walls. It was strange. 20 years of marriage had just ended, and yet the people inside seemed happier than they had all night. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The divorce papers rested on the passenger seat. For several seconds, I simply stared through the windshield as snowflakes landed against the glass. Most people imagine a moment like that feels devastating. Maybe it should have. Instead, what I felt was clarity. Because the truth was that Christmas Eve had not destroyed my marriage. It had only revealed what had been changing for years. I finally started the engine and pulled away from the curb. The streets were nearly empty. Christmas decorations glowed from front porches. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children played in snow-covered yards. Everywhere I looked, life seemed wrapped in warmth and tradition. Yet my mind kept drifting backward through time. I remembered the first apartment Nicole and I shared after we got married. It sat above a small hardware store on the edge of town. The heating system barely worked during winter. The kitchen was so small that only one person could stand in it comfortably. We owned mismatched furniture and counted every dollar carefully. Looking back, those years should have felt difficult. Instead, they remained some of the happiest years of my life. We used to stay awake late talking about our future. We dreamed about owning a home. We dreamed about traveling. We dreamed about building something together. Back then, every victory felt shared. Every setback felt temporary. We were partners. At least, that was what I believed. As the truck moved through the quiet streets, more memories surfaced. Long workdays, weekend projects, late nights studying contracts and financial reports. There were years when I worked harder than I thought possible. Not because I enjoyed working, because I believed I was building a future for my family. Success arrived slowly, one step at a time, one decision at a time, one sacrifice at a time. Most people only see the results. They never see the years required to create them. Nicole's family certainly never did. Richard liked to speak confidently about success, but he rarely understood what it actually required. Kevin enjoyed making jokes about business and money despite never taking many risks himself. Over the years, I helped them more times than I could count. I connected Kevin with job opportunities. I introduced Richard to business contacts. I quietly assisted whenever problems appeared. I never kept score because family is not supposed to work that way. But somewhere along the journey, appreciation slowly transformed into expectation. Then expectation transformed into entitlement. The change happened gradually. Small comments, casual dismissals, jokes that carried a little more truth than humor. At first, I ignored them. Then I excused them. Eventually, they became impossible to miss. The snow continued falling as I drove through downtown. Reflections from holiday lights danced across the windshield. I stopped at a red light and suddenly remembered something Nicole said almost 2 years earlier. We had attended a charity event together. On the drive home, she spent nearly 20 minutes talking about another couple, their house, their vacations, their social circle, their lifestyle. I remember asking a simple question. Are you happy with our life? She hesitated before answering. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds, yet it stayed with me for years. Looking back now, I think that was the moment I first realized something important had changed. My phone buzzed on the center console, pulling me back to the present. A message appeared on the screen. It was from a man I trusted more than almost anyone. Matthew Collins. The text contained only 4 words. We should meet tomorrow. Most people would have ignored the significance of such a simple message. I did not. Matthew never wasted words. As I continued driving through the snowy streets, I found myself smiling for the first time that night. Inside the Bennett house, they believed they understood exactly who I was. The problem was that they only knew the version of me they had invented. And very soon, that misunderstanding was going to become extremely important. Edit the next morning arrived cold and quiet. Fresh snow covered the neighborhood, turning every rooftop and driveway into a smooth blanket of white. I met Matthew Collins at his office just after 9 o'clock. His building overlooked downtown, where traffic moved slowly beneath a pale winter sky. The moment I walked into his conference room, he looked at me and smiled. You seem calmer than most people would be, he said. I took a seat across from him. Maybe because none of what happened surprised me. Matthew nodded as though he had expected that answer. A pot of coffee sat between us. Sunlight streamed through the large windows behind him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question that immediately pulled me backward through years of memories. When did you first realize things were changing? At first, I did not answer. Not because I lacked an answer. Because there were too many. Looking back, marriages rarely collapse in a single moment. They drift apart one decision at a time. One conversation at a time. One disappointment at a time. I remembered a family barbecue nearly 5 years earlier. Richard spent most of the afternoon talking about another man he admired. A businessman who owned a larger house, drove more expensive vehicles, and belonged to an exclusive country club. Every story seemed designed to make a point. At the time, I laughed it off. But later that evening, Nicole repeated several of the same comments during our drive home. He seems successful, she had said. I remember glancing at her. Successful compared to who? She never answered directly. That conversation stayed with me far longer than it should have. Then there were the holidays. Every year seemed to bring a new comparison. Someone else's vacation. Someone else's investment property. Someone else's lifestyle. The strange part was that we already had a good life. A beautiful home. Financial stability. Freedom to travel. Yet none of that seemed to matter anymore. It was as though gratitude slowly lost ground to comparison. Matthew listened carefully as I spoke. "Do you think her family influenced her?" he asked. I considered the question. Influence? I said. Yes. Control? No. That distinction mattered. It is easy to blame relatives. Harder to admit that adults make their own choices. Nicole chose what she valued. The Bennett family simply encouraged it. I remembered another moment from 3 years earlier. We had attended a Christmas gathering at Richard's house. During dinner, Kevin joked that I was lucky Nicole stayed with me because she could probably do better. Several people laughed. Even Nicole smiled. It lasted only a second. Most people would have forgotten it immediately. I never did. Not because the joke hurt. Because nobody at the table seemed to think it was inappropriate. That told me everything. Respect had quietly disappeared, and nobody even noticed. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Richard treated my achievements as expected rather than earned. Kevin treated my patience as weakness. Nicole increasingly viewed our life through the lens of what other people possessed rather than what we had built together. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. I simply kept convincing myself they were temporary. Matthew finally leaned forward. "Garrett, there is something interesting about people who underestimate others." "What is that?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "They eventually start believing their own assumptions." The room fell silent. Outside the window, sunlight reflected off the snowy streets below. "The Bennett family thinks they understand you," he continued. "They think they know how your life works. They think they know where everything stands." I could not help smiling. "That makes one of us." Matthew laughed quietly before reaching for a folder resting beside him. He placed it on the table, but did not open it. "The problem," he said, tapping the cover once, "is that they have been looking at the wrong version of the story for years." My eyes moved toward the folder. Years of paperwork rested inside. Years of decisions. Matthew finally opened the folder and slowly spread several documents across the conference table. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Legal paperwork. Signatures. Filing dates. Ownership records. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would attract attention from anyone who was not trained to understand what they were looking at. Yet as I stared at those pages, I felt as though I was looking through a window into the past. 7 years earlier, I had sat in this exact office across from the same attorney. Back then, my life looked completely different. Nicole and I were still presenting ourselves as a happy couple. The business was growing steadily. The future seemed predictable, at least on the surface. Matthew tapped one of the documents with his finger. "Do you remember why you came to see me?" he asked. I nodded immediately. I remembered every detail. A business owner I knew had gone through a difficult divorce. Years of work became trapped inside legal disputes that seemed to last forever. Employees suffered. Partnerships suffered. Opportunities disappeared. Watching that situation unfold taught me something important. Life does not always move in the direction people expect. Preparation is not pessimism. Preparation is responsibility. That lesson brought me into Matthew's office 7 years earlier. Back then, we spent months reviewing business structures, ownership arrangements, future planning strategies, and legal safeguards. None of it was secret. None of it was hidden. Everything was legal. Everything was documented properly. Everything existed exactly where it was supposed to exist. The difference was that most people never paid attention to those details. Nicole certainly never did. I remembered trying to explain some of the planning decisions during those years. She usually listened politely for a few minutes before changing the subject. Financial documents bored her. Legal paperwork bored her. Ownership structures bored her. Looking back, that lack of interest would eventually become very important. Matthew slid another document toward me. "This signature right here," he said. I looked down. My signature sat at the bottom of the page beside a date from 7 years ago. Such a simple thing. A few strokes of ink. Yet that signature represented months of planning and years of discipline. "Most people think major life changes happen in dramatic moments," Matthew said. "The truth is that most major life changes begin with decisions nobody notices." Sunlight streamed through the office windows, reflecting across the polished table. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary winter morning. Inside, a series of ordinary decisions were quietly waiting to become very significant. The Bennett family thinks this story started on Christmas Eve, Matthew continued. They think the divorce is the beginning. I smiled slightly. And it is not. Not even close. He leaned back in his chair. The real beginning happened years ago when you decided to prepare instead of assuming everything would always stay the same. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Matthew reached into the folder and removed another set of documents. These looked even less interesting than the first group. Yet his expression immediately changed. These are the ones that matter most. I studied the pages carefully. Ownership records, trust documentation, business agreements, long-term planning mechanisms. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate, nothing hidden. Just years of responsible preparation sitting quietly inside a folder. Matthew closed the file and folded his hands. There is something else you should know. His voice became more serious. What? I asked. He looked directly at me. Last night, somebody from Nicole's side reached out indirectly looking for answers. That caught my attention. Who? Matthew shook his head. The identity is not important right now. Then what is? He smiled slightly. The fact that questions have already started. Outside, a cloud drifted across the winter sky, briefly darkening the room before sunlight returned. Questions mean assumptions are beginning to crack, Matthew said. And once that process starts, it becomes very difficult to. The next 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. If somebody had looked at the situation from the outside, they might have assumed everything was proceeding exactly as expected. Christmas decorations still covered the Bennett house. Holiday photos still appeared on social media. Relatives continued exchanging cheerful messages. On the surface, life seemed normal. That was the interesting thing about assumptions. They often survive for a little while after reality begins moving in the opposite direction. I spent most of those days working. Year-end reports needed attention. Meetings still had to happen. Employees still depended on leadership. Life does not pause simply because personal problems appear. Yet every evening, I found myself thinking about the people gathered around that Christmas tree. Not because I missed them, because I wondered how long confidence would last once questions started arriving. The answer came sooner than expected. Late on the third afternoon, Matthew called. I was sitting in my home office reviewing contracts when his name appeared on my screen. Outside, snow covered the backyard, reflecting the fading winter sunlight. The first review came back, he said the moment I answered. His voice sounded calm, but I immediately recognized the significance. And? I asked. Matthew laughed quietly. Let us just say the conversation has changed. I leaned back in my chair. That quickly, much quicker than I expected. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he continued. Several assumptions were challenged today. Assumptions. The same word kept appearing. Not facts. Not evidence. Assumptions. People often confuse those things. The difference becomes obvious only when reality arrives. Later that evening, I received another update through a source Matthew trusted. Apparently, the Bennett family had gathered once again at Richard's house. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner. The lights still glowed. Holiday decorations remained scattered throughout the living room. Yet the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Richard reportedly spent most of the evening discussing numbers. Kevin searched for information online. Several relatives who had been enthusiastic a few nights earlier suddenly seemed much less interested in making predictions. Confidence was beginning to fade. Curiosity was taking its place. Around 7 o'clock, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. Nicole. The screen displayed only a short sentence. Hope you are doing okay. I stared at the message for several seconds before responding. It was the first time she had contacted me directly since Christmas Eve. I typed a simple reply. I am doing fine. I hope you are too. Several minutes passed before another message arrived. This one was different. Have you spoken with Matthew recently? I could not help smiling. There it was. The first real sign. Curiosity. Questions rarely appear when people feel completely certain. I looked out the window toward the snow-covered yard before answering. We talk when necessary. Her response came almost immediately. Is there something I should know? The question itself told me everything. 3 days earlier, nobody inside that house believed there were questions worth asking. Now questions were becoming the center of every conversation. I placed the phone on my desk and thought carefully before replying. If there is something important to know, your attorney will explain it. Nearly 10 minutes passed before another message appeared. This time there was no question, only silence disguised as words. Okay. That single word felt heavier than the entire conversation. Later that night, Matthew called again. Richard requested another review, he said. Already? Yes. I walked toward the kitchen and poured a glass of water. That seems fast. Matthew laughed. People move quickly when certainty starts disappearing. I stood beside the window watching snowflakes drift through the darkness. Across the street, Christmas lights glowed from neighboring homes. Families were still celebrating the holiday season. Meanwhile, inside one particular house, celebration was slowly being replaced by concern. What happens next? I asked. Matthew paused briefly before answering. The second review begins tomorrow morning. And another pause followed. Then his voice became very serious. Garrett, the first review only raised questions. The second review is going to provide answers. And I do not think anybody in that family is prepared for what those answers are going to reveal. The second review finished the following afternoon. I knew something significant had happened before Matthew even called. There are moments when you can almost feel the direction of a story changing. That day felt exactly like that. I was sitting in my office overlooking a snow-covered parking lot when my phone rang. Matthew's name appeared on the screen. The moment I answered, I heard it in his voice. Not excitement. Not surprise. Certainty. The second review is complete, he said. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. How bad? Matthew laughed quietly. That depends on your perspective. I waited. For the Bennett family? Another short laugh. Considerably worse than the first review. Outside, a delivery truck pulled slowly through the snow while gray clouds drifted across the winter sky. Everything looked calm. Ordinary. Yet somewhere across town, several people were discovering that reality rarely negotiates with expectations. Matthew explained that multiple professionals had now reviewed the documentation. Independent opinions. Independent conclusions. Different people reaching the same result. The consistency mattered. Nobody is arguing with the facts anymore, he said. Now they are trying to understand how they misunderstood the situation in the first place. That statement stayed with me long after the call ended. Because misunderstanding had always been the real problem. Not paperwork. Not legal structures. Misunderstanding. Later that evening, another update reached Matthew through the same source who had been quietly observing events from inside the Bennett circle. According to the report, the atmosphere inside Richard's house had changed completely. The Christmas decorations were still there. The tree still stood near the fireplace. Holiday cards still covered the mantel. Yet the mood felt nothing like Christmas anymore. Richard reportedly spent most of the evening pacing between rooms. Kevin had stopped making jokes. Several relatives who once spoke confidently about the future suddenly had very little to say. Most interesting of all was Nicole. Apparently, she remained unusually quiet throughout the entire gathering. No arguments. No celebrations. No predictions. Just silence. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Nicole. For several seconds, I simply watched the screen. Then I answered. Hello. Her voice sounded different. The confidence from Christmas Eve had disappeared. The curiosity from a few days earlier was gone too. What remained sounded like uncertainty. Garrett, she said softly. Can I ask you something? I walked toward the kitchen window and looked outside at the snow-covered backyard. Of course. She hesitated before speaking again. Did you know this would happen? The question was interesting because it revealed what she was really asking. Not whether the documents existed. Not whether the reviews were accurate. She wanted to know whether I expected all of this. I knew what I signed years ago, I replied calmly. Silence followed. So you knew? She asked. I knew I believed in being prepared. Another long pause. Then she asked the question I had been expecting. Why did you never tell me? I thought about that carefully. Nicole, I did tell you. More than once. You just were not interested in the details. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of us had said. Because sometimes the most difficult truths are the ones that do not require an argument. Eventually she spoke again. My attorney says nobody did anything wrong. That is because nobody did. Then why does it feel like everything is changing? Snow drifted slowly across the yard as I searched for the right answer. Because assumptions are being replaced by facts, I said. And that process is uncomfortable for everyone. Nicole did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded tired. I do not think my family understands what is happening. That makes two of us, I replied. After the call ended, I stood quietly beside the window for several minutes. The neighborhood lights reflected across the snow. Families were still enjoying the holiday season. Life continued moving forward. A few minutes later, Matthew called again. I just received another update, he said. What now? His answer came immediately. Richard has requested a full explanation of everything. I smiled slightly. And Matthew paused. And tomorrow is the day he finally gets one. Garrett, the questions are over. Tomorrow, they get the complete picture. And once that happens, nobody in that family is ever going to look at this situation the same way again. The complete explanation took place the following day. I was not in the room when it happened, but by then Matthew had several reliable sources, and the details reached me quickly. According to everyone involved, the atmosphere inside the meeting was completely different from the confidence that filled the Bennett house on Christmas Eve. There were no celebrations, no predictions, no jokes, only questions. Richard arrived expecting clarification. Instead, he received education. The professionals conducting the review walked through years of documentation one section at a time. Ownership records, trust arrangements, business structures, long-term planning decisions. Every document led naturally to the next. Every answer generated a deeper understanding of how everything actually worked. What surprised Richard most was not that the documents existed. It was that they had existed for years. Apparently, he kept returning to the same question. Why had nobody known about this? The answer was simple. Because nobody had cared enough to ask. The truth had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored. Later that afternoon, Matthew invited me to his office. Snow still covered parts of downtown, although warmer temperatures had begun melting the edges of sidewalks and parking lots. Winter sunlight poured through the large windows overlooking the city. When I entered the conference room, several folders rested on the table. Matthew looked unusually relaxed. I take it the meeting was interesting, I said. He smiled. Very. I sat across from him. How did Richard handle it? Matthew laughed quietly. Not as well as he expected. For a moment, he reviewed a few notes before continuing. The biggest shock was not financial. That caught my attention immediately. Then what was? He folded his hands together. The realization that they built an entire story around assumptions. The room became quiet. Outside, cars moved slowly through downtown traffic. Inside, years of misunderstanding were finally becoming visible. Matthew continued. Richard believed he understood your success. Kevin believed he understood your business. Nicole believed she understood your future. He paused. None of them actually understood the structure supporting any of it. I could not help smiling. That sounds familiar. It should. He leaned back in his chair. People see results and assume they understand the process. Most of the time they do not. Later that evening, another update arrived from inside the Bennett circle. This one surprised me more than the others. According to the source, nobody argued after the meeting ended. Richard remained unusually quiet. Kevin spent most of the evening staring at paperwork. Several relatives left early. The confidence that once dominated every conversation had disappeared entirely. But the most surprising reaction belonged to Nicole. Apparently, she asked to see everything herself. Every document, every explanation, every review. She spent hours going through the information, not looking for mistakes, looking for understanding. That detail stayed with me because it represented something new. Reflection. For the first time since Christmas Eve, she was not searching for confirmation. She was searching for truth. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Nicole. When I answered, her voice sounded softer than I had ever heard it. I finally understand, she said. There was no greeting, no small talk, just that sentence. I walked toward the living room window and looked out at the quiet neighborhood. Understand what? I asked. She exhaled slowly. The story I believed was never real. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she continued. I spent years thinking I knew exactly who you were. Outside, snow reflected the glow of nearby streetlights. And now? I asked. Another pause followed. Now I think I only knew the version I wanted to see. Her honesty surprised me. Not because she admitted being wrong. Because she sounded genuinely disappointed in herself. Eventually the conversation ended. No arguments. No accusations. Just silence and reflection. Afterward, I sat alone for a long time thinking about everything that had happened. The strange thing was that I felt no satisfaction. No victory. Only perspective. Because the real loss was never financial. The real loss was trust. And according to Matthew, Nicole was finally beginning to understand exactly how much of it had disappeared over the years. The next morning, he called with one final update. "You were wrong about one thing," he said. "What is that?" His answer came immediately. "You thought Richard would be the most affected by all this." I frowned. And Matthew looked directly at me through the video call. "The person struggling the most right now is Nicole, because she is finally seeing everything she spent years refusing to notice." Nearly a month passed before I heard from Nicole again. January slowly gave way to early February. The Christmas decorations disappeared from front porches. Snow melted from sidewalks. Life moved forward the way it always does, whether people are ready for it or not. During those weeks, I focused on work, family, and rebuilding routines that had been interrupted for far too long. What surprised me most was how peaceful everything felt. Not because my circumstances were perfect, because uncertainty had finally been replaced by clarity. One Saturday afternoon, I was organizing paperwork in my home office when my phone buzzed. "Nicole." For several seconds, I simply looked at the screen. Then I answered. "Hello." Her voice sounded hesitant. "Garrett, do you have a few minutes?" I glanced out the window. The backyard was wet from melting snow, and sunlight reflected off small patches of ice that still remained near the fence line. "I do." A brief silence followed. "I think I owe you an apology." The words did not surprise me. The timing did. For months, every conversation had revolved around documents, reviews, assumptions, and explanations. This felt different. Personal. Human. "Go ahead," I said quietly. Nicole exhaled slowly. "The strange thing is that I spent years believing I understood exactly what was wrong with our marriage." Another pause followed. "Now I am not sure I understood it at all." I remained silent and allowed her to continue. "I kept focusing on what I thought was missing," she said. "Other people seemed happier, more successful, more exciting. I spent so much time looking at what everyone else had that I stopped appreciating what was already in front of me." Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees. Winter was slowly loosening its grip on the neighborhood. "My family did not help," she admitted. "But the decisions were still mine." That statement mattered more than she probably realized. Accountability is rare. Genuine accountability is even rarer. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Her answer came immediately. "Because I finally stopped blaming everyone else." The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. There were no arguments. No attempts to rewrite history. No excuses. For the first time in years, Nicole spoke honestly about her own choices instead of other people's mistakes. When the call ended, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because she apologized. Because she finally seemed willing to face reality. A few days later, Matthew called with another update. "Things are changing over there," he said. "How so?" "Richard and Kevin are not speaking much." That surprised me. The Bennett family had always appeared united. "What happened?" Matthew laughed softly. "Apparently everyone has a different theory about who is responsible for what happened." I walked through the living room and poured a cup of coffee. "That sounds exhausting." "It probably is." He paused before continuing. "The interesting part is that Nicole has mostly removed herself from those conversations." "Really?" "According to my source, she spends most of her time reflecting instead of arguing." After the call ended, I found myself thinking about something Matthew had said months earlier. People eventually start believing their own assumptions. The Bennett family had spent years creating a version of reality that felt comfortable. When that version collapsed, they did not know what to do with the truth. The following week brought another surprise. A handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox. The return address belonged to Nicole. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully. The letter was not dramatic. It contained no grand declarations, no requests, no attempts to change the past. Instead, it was filled with reflection. She wrote about gratitude, regret, lessons learned, opportunities wasted. One sentence stood out more than any other. "I spent years comparing you to people who had never made the sacrifices you made for us." I read that sentence several times, not because it changed anything, because it revealed understanding, true understanding, something that had been missing for a very long time. Later that evening, I placed the letter inside a drawer and went for a walk through the neighborhood. The air felt warmer than it had in weeks. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Families worked in their yards. The season was changing. As I turned onto my street, My phone rang. Matthew again. I have one final update, he said. What now? His voice carried a hint of amusement. You are not going to believe this. I smiled. Try me. He paused briefly. Nicole wants to meet with you in person. I stopped walking. Why? Matthew's answer came immediately. Because there is something she wants to say face to face. And according to everyone around her, she has been thinking about it for nearly a year. Almost 1 year passed before I finally sat across from Nicole again. By then, another Christmas season had arrived. The city was decorated with lights. Storefront windows displayed wreaths and garlands. Snow covered parts of the sidewalks, and the air carried that familiar mixture of cold wind and holiday nostalgia. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near downtown, a quiet place where neither of us was likely to be recognized. When I arrived, Nicole was already there. She sat near the window, staring out at the falling snow. For a moment, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked different, because she carried herself differently. The confidence that once came from certainty had been replaced by something far more valuable. Humility. She stood when she saw me and offered a small smile. We sat down, ordered coffee, and for several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally, Nicole broke the silence. Thank you for coming. I nodded. You said there was something important you wanted to say. She looked down at her cup before answering. There is. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly past the glass. The scene felt strangely familiar, almost like a reflection of the Christmas that had changed everything. I spent most of this year trying to understand how I got so much wrong, she said quietly. Not just about the divorce. About us. I listened without interrupting. For a long time, I convinced myself that I deserved something different. Something better. I compared our life to other people's lives. I listened to opinions that should never have mattered. And eventually I stopped appreciating the person standing right beside me. Her voice never cracked. She never became emotional. Somehow that made her words feel even more sincere. The hardest part, she continued, was realizing that you tried to tell me. More than once. I just was not listening. I looked out the window for a moment before answering. People usually hear what they want to hear. She nodded slowly. I know that now. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. We talked about mistakes, expectations, family influence, personal responsibility. For the first time in years, there was no tension between us. No hidden agenda. No argument waiting beneath the surface. Just two people discussing the consequences of choices that could never be undone. Eventually, Nicole smiled sadly. Do you ever regret anything? She asked. I thought carefully before answering. Of course. The marriage. I shook my head. No. I regret how long it took me to accept reality. Nicole lowered her eyes. That is fair. Another silence settled between us. Yet this one felt peaceful, comfortable, necessary. Finally, she reached into her purse and removed a small envelope. I wrote something, she said. You do not have to read it now, or ever, but I wanted you to have it. I accepted the envelope and placed it beside my coffee. Then Nicole stood. I think this is goodbye. I stood as well. I think it is. She smiled one last time before walking toward the door. A few seconds later, she disappeared into the snowy afternoon. I watched through the window as she crossed the street and vanished among the holiday crowds. And strangely enough, I felt no anger, no resentment, no desire for revenge, only gratitude for the lessons life had forced me to learn. Later that evening, I returned home and stepped onto the back porch with a cup of coffee. Snow drifted through the darkness. Christmas lights glowed from neighboring houses. The world looked almost identical to the night everything fell apart. Yet I was not the same man anymore. The greatest victory had never been the paperwork. It had never been proving anyone wrong. It had never been watching assumptions collapse. The greatest victory was finding peace after losing something I once thought I could not live without. As I stood there watching the snow fall beneath the winter sky, I realized something simple. The people who celebrated what they believed was my ending had unknowingly witnessed the beginning of my freedom. And now I would love to know your thoughts. If you had been sitting in that living room on Christmas Eve, what would have gone through your mind? Do you think Nicole truly understood her mistakes by the end, or was the realization simply too late? If stories about resilience, self-respect, difficult lessons, and unexpected personal growth resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this one. Sometimes the most powerful endings are not about winning. They are about finally becoming free.